Is it on? All right. Can people hear me in the back? Yes. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining in our symposium about poultry enrichments. We'd like to first thank the PSA for allowing us to host this symposium on this topic, and the University of Arkansas's Center for Food Animal Wellbeing for supporting this symposium. And although it's only my name on the schedule, we actually have organized this symposium as a team, so I'd like to take a few minutes to just introduce the team before we start on the talks. So myself and 3 of my colleagues at other universities have established the Poultry Extension Collaborative. So the 4 of us are all research and extension faculty that work in the realm of poultry welfare, and I would just like to introduce them really quick. So our first member is Dr. Marissa Erasmus. She's an associate professor at Perdue University. She couldn't be here today, unfortunately, but she's here in our hearts. Her work mostly focuses on turkey welfare. Then we have Dr. Shauna Weimer, who is an assistant professor. She is here at the University of Arkansas and the director for the Center of Food and Animal Wellbeing. Her research mostly focuses on broiler chicken welfare. Then we have Dr. Prafula Regmi from UGA, here also, and his work focuses on skeletal research in laying hens. And then myself, I'm at Virginia Tech, focusing my research on positive effective state and sustainable poultry production. So just some introduction about PEC, because we're relatively new. As I said, established in 2020, so our pandemic baby in a way. Our mission is to advance poultry welfare through research, extension, and outreach. So we try to meet that goal or obtain that mission to develop science-based outreach materials, and I'll give some examples in a little bit. And the goal is to sort of guide poultry welfare decision-making. We also try to identify needs from stakeholders, so people from the industry. We include both large and small, so the whole range of like poultry producers. And we conduct research to fulfill those needs, with then the outcomes incorporated in our outreach and education materials. So some examples are our newsletters. We publish a monthly newsletter that is peer-reviewed in that we all review each other's newsletters. And these are science-based newsletters and we focus on topics that fall within our expertise, like euthanasia of poultry, or timely topics like avian influenza in March, or topics that are suggested by our subscribers. For instance, we had some newsletters about using technology in the poultry industry. Then an example of our educational work is the organization of webinars. We had our last webinar in May where we focused on improving laying hen welfare. We try to include speakers from both the industry and academia where we can and where it's relevant. And these webinars are freely accessible, as in anyone can join. They're online, obviously. And in our last webinar, we had about 140 attendees from 23 countries, so we're pretty proud of that sort of broad reach. And we try to really make this information very accessible, so when we can, we will post the videos on our website or on our YouTube page so that anyone can access the information. Then finally, we aim to interact with stakeholders, so that could be anyone in this room. We really want to hear from you. What are your needs? What are your interests in this realm? Do you see any needs in terms of education, research, outreach? We would like to talk to you. So come talk to us here at PSA or contact us in one of our many ways you can contact us. We have had the opportunity already to sit down with some interest groups and affiliated like industry groups, so we've been really happy about that. So if you do want to reach out to us, not in person here, but through online methods, we have an email address, as you can see on the slides. We have a Facebook page where you can reach us, where we also publish our newsletters on. We have Twitter and our website with contact form. So feel free to reach out if there's anything you'd like to discuss in this realm. All right, so let's get on to the matter at hand, why we're all here. We're here for the symposium entitled Enhancing Their Quality of Life, Environmental Enrichment for Poultry. And I'm happy to introduce our first speaker of today, Dr. Ruth Newberry, who is a professor in ethology. And her research focuses on behavioral developments, environmental enrichments, and poultry play. And today she's going to talk to us about that third topic. So please, Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me here. It's great to be at Poultry Science once again. And today the topic is playful poultry. What does it take and what does it mean? Just to give you a little outline of what I'm going to talk about, what does play look like? What does it take in terms of environmental enrichment? What does it mean in terms of animal welfare? How can we measure it, and what next? This is not what play looks like, routine, trained behavior, but let's just think, how would we recognize play? Criteria for play include that the behavior is spontaneous, so not something that's needed for current immediate survival. It occurs in flexible sequences. It's non-injurious, which means that if there's any kind of pain or fright, they'll stop playing. It's self-handicapping in the sense that the behavior can be exaggerated and take more energy than it really needs to get from one place to another. In social play, it's not bullying behavior. And finally, it offers surprises. It gives opportunities for birds to train for the unexpected and learn how to recover from this. We can classify play as locomotory, social, and object play. So and I've got some turkeys in here. Sorry, Marissa's not here. Here we can see some locomotory play. The sound doesn't seem to be working, but they're twittering. And you can see they're jumping, they're flapping, and they're running. Here's some social play, sometimes referred to as sparring or play fighting. And the main thing here is that it's non-injurious, and it often leads to nothing, as you'll see in a moment. Follow the circles. It goes quick. That was one. And there we have another one. And then what do you do after that? Well, you're a broiler. You sit down. Object play. We can think of this as worm running behavior. In worm running with real mealworms, what happens is they don't really play. They grab it, they turn around, put their head down and eat it as fast as possible and come back for more. With object play, they'll take these little long articles that are inedible and they'll run around with them and they'll be peeping, beep, 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 beep. They'll run away, but then they'll run back into the crowd again. Look at me, look what I've got. Follow the circles, it goes fast with little bits of peat in this case. It's got one. Ooh. Little tussle. Oh, another one got it. Now there's another one come in for the side, running down. One got a bit there, but it still got some and it runs off into the crowd. If we compare who did the worm running and who's successful in holding on to it, we don't find that predicts dominance relationships later in life. Okay, what does it take? in terms of environmental enrichment? Well, classic enrichment study, we have an area, a control area, which is relatively little space and nothing in it, really, nothing much to do in it. Whereas an enriched environment has more space and provides some objects or materials that give different things for the animals to do. So I'm going to think about this with chickens now. First of all, with what's in the environment, and secondly, about the space. Here we have an experiment with turkey trees. That's a tree, in case you didn't recognize it, versus the control, no turkey tree. And they didn't call it play, but they measured running and flying, and hey, no difference between enriched and control. Here's another one with commercial broilers. They had environments without enrichments or with platforms with perches on them, or without, with or without dust baths. And if you look across the graphs, you'll see that there's no significant difference across different treatments in terms of the amount of play. Frolicking and sparring are the most common types. Here's a study we did at Guelph, and this is the enriched environment as compared to a similar environment without those enrichments, which were a platform, a weighing scale, a peck stone, and a little container which had fresh wood shavings added to it regularly. Hey, you're getting the idea? No difference in play. Now this is one we did in Norway that has 4 different kinds of enrichments. There's peat dust baths, there's peat bales, there's lucerne bales, and there's platforms. We divided the house in half with a fence. Half the house had enrichments, the other did not, and then we switched round with the next flock to see to control for side bias. We found more wing flapping, and we saw jumping versus no jumping in the unenriched environment, and a tendency for more worm running, although no difference in frolicking and sparring. I'm working up here to some significant effects. Yeah, significance, woo! That's statistician's nightmare. Here we are. We don't use p-values anymore. Here we go. The more types of enrichments put into the environment, the more play we saw across fast-growing broiler flocks. This is in undisturbed conditions. Here's a study with layer pullets, where we offered either one type of litter and one type of perch, or 4 types of litter and 4 types of perch. And ta-da! Significant difference in early play levels with more play in the enriched or multi-choice environment. I mean, you could say they're both enriched, but one is more enriched and more complex. Now we get to the space, and this is where we see more reliable, clear results in terms of differences in play. As we increase the space allowance, the more play we see, and especially in the most common types of play, which are frolicking and sparring. And we also see this if you imagine you're walking through the house and you're looking in front of you. The birds are getting out of the way, so they're not playing. But turn around and look behind you, and there'll be an area of space that's sort of cleared out behind you as you were walking. And lo and behold, that's where the birds are playing. There's lots of play going on in this area that's just been cleared out temporarily with some space. You'll see frolicking and sparring, a little bit of wing flapping, and hopping and jumping. It's not just that they're trying to get more space, though, in this behavior. It's not like they're going away from the more crowded places in order to get to the free place because they didn't like the lack of space, so much as that they're going into this opportunity to play. And we can see that in an old study I did where we had chickens with lots of space, and then next door we had an empty pen, and every day we opened the gate between them for 3 hours. And as soon as you got open the gate, once they were familiar with this other place and used to going there, they would be kicking and screaming to get through to the other side. So lots of frolicking to go next door. We got the idea, well, space stimulates play, so could we stimulate it experimentally in a kind of free space test? This was in the Guelph study. And these were small pens, so we simply removed the feeder in order to give a bit more space for a few minutes. We tested 5 minutes here. And here's the surprise. Guess where they played the most? In the control treatment, not the enriched treatment. So we've got to be really careful how we interpret play, especially levels of play. And we did another test also. We did a worm test where we threw in little bits of twisted paper and then looked for 5 minutes. And both of these tests stimulate play, no doubt about it. But, surprise, surprise, it's the control treatment where they're doing more of the worm running play than the enriched play. We think this is probably because the enriched environment has more things to occupy the birds and is more structurally complex. And so maybe they don't notice the difference as much when you do some small change as when you have a more barren environment. So what does it mean for welfare? Well, in other species, although this hasn't been specifically studied in poultry, we know that play occurs more often, or you see it when the birds are feeling pretty safe, they're pretty relaxed, they don't have urgent needs to attend to, like feeding their babies or escaping predators or things like that. Under those conditions, play is suppressed. So we can say, in young birds at least, that if we don't see any play, that's probably a bad sign in terms of welfare. The question is more like, if you have play and you have different levels of play, it's a little more tricky to interpret that. It depends on the context. If we compare a fast-growing broiler strain with 2 slower-growing strains, and this is following disturbance, so looking in the place behind the person walking through, we saw lots of play stimulated, but more so in the slower-growing strains than the fastest-growing strain, which was condition 4. And we saw this both in age-matched birds and in weight-matched birds. And this was not a density effect in this study. Even though we had 2 different densities, they were pretty close together, and we didn't detect density effects in this study. The interesting thing, though, is that the difference in play is correlated with signs of health and fitness. So in the birds in condition 4, they had the highest levels of foot problems and leg problems and the highest level of condemnation at the factory, the processor. Mary Baxter and colleagues have found a similar kind of result in Ireland with Ross 308 versus Hubbard Redbro. If we just compare a fast-growing strain across flocks, and we know there's variation between flocks, then we find that higher body weights and lower mortality are correlated with higher levels of play, suggesting, therefore, that the play is giving us some indication of the fitness of the birds. In our pullet experiment, you'll remember that they were playing more when young in the multi-choice environment than the control or single-choice environment. And looking further on in age, in the adults, we saw that in the multi-choice environment, they were showing less aggressive pecking as adults, and at later rearing and as adults, they had less feather damage. So again, consistent with the idea that play is indicating to us something about the health status of the birds. How can we measure it? Just show you one example here where we've attempted a method for introducing measures into commercial assessment protocols. And here we have a system that's based on the idea of transect sampling, where we walk up and down the rows, we stop at various intervals, we first look across 2 rows to the undisturbed birds. We then turn around and look behind us and count the play going on behind us. And then we move up again, and we move up and down the different rows, watching disturbed and undisturbed transit patches, which we can define visually by looking at the space between the feeder and drinkers lines, and then taking 3 feeders and across. That's our space. Then you can count for 15 seconds how many birds show each type of play. There's more to it if you want to know. I can explain the details. Some factors to take into account when we want to compare play between treatments. First of all, we know there's a strong age difference in play, so we don't want to compare apples with oranges here. They have to be similar age. I don't think anyone's reported it in poultry yet. Low-hanging fruit here. There's likely to be a sex difference. In other species, we see more social play in males and more locomotory play in females, but I don't know what age that might show up. Of course, they don't play when it's dark. They play when they're active. We know that light intensity affects activity, so it can be predicted that there would be differences depending on the lighting conditions. I've already shown you that disturbance will alter the level of play along with space allowance. So the context in which it occurs is very important. And finally, it's very, it's not a very common behavior. You're lucky if you see 1% of the time and they're playing. So it's kind of long observation sessions, unless you do something to stimulate play, like our tests, but then you have to know how to interpret them. So we desperately need to automate. There's probably some people doing it already. Maybe Ingrid is, I don't know. We need to automate the data collection so we can capture play over longer periods. So just to conclude then, what's next? Well, so far in welfare discussions, there's been so much emphasis on reducing suffering. So we're always thinking, how to reduce the leg problems, how to reduce the mortality and so on. The focus is on the negative aspects of welfare. But isn't it time that we looked also at the positive end of welfare, to look at what happens and how it relates to things like productivity and health? If we add more opportunities and pleasures and give the birds a really good life. And so the question is, where does play fit in all that? So just to conclude here, interpretation is a big issue. We really need to understand that better. We need to look not just at poultry, chickens, but more on turkeys and quail and ostriches and other exciting poultry species. And we need to determine what is a good level of play and how best to stimulate that, and we need to figure out better ways that are practical to assess the levels. Here are just some of the many people that have been involved in the studies I've mentioned today. And I'll end with some exuberant and exaggerated running and jumping and flying. Thank you.
Questions?
So, one question from a neophyte with behavioral type of stuff.
Oh, I was looking at him when I, sorry.
Well, he can go first, that's okay. Anyway, we've looked at behaviors a little bit, just as an amateur, it's not my business. And my impression is that photo intensity, if I wanted to stimulate play, I just turn the photo intensity up, and I'll get lots of play. And we've also done some remedial stuff with perches, with turkeys, and the photo intensity seems to make a great deal of difference there too. I just wondered if you had some comments on that.
I think you're probably quite right. I mean, we haven't looked specifically at what elements of play, but you can certainly see that those things activate the birds. So yes, it sounds like another low-hanging fruit area for research.
Hi, Ruth.
Hi.
Greg Fraley. So I work with ducks, and I'm curious about how your interpretation of some of these behaviors as play. So a lot of times when, the rapid running and flapping, in the person wake, I see that all the time with ducks, but I've interpreted that as they're like getting the hell away from me, as opposed to stimulating play. I mean, how exactly do you tease apart the interpretation of what actually constitutes play?
That's a good question, because as I say, the context in which the play occurs is very critical to the interpretation. So if we have conditions where they're doing it in order to get away from something or to get to something that they really need now, those are like survival needs in the bird's mind, get away or get what I need now. And we wouldn't include them in the classification of play, because play occurs after those survival needs have been taken care of. So some of it might be play, but probably not in the context that you mentioned.
So you're saying it's kind of a matter of timing, like so that initial run away from me, but then 30 seconds, 10 yards away, 10 meters away.
They may be playing quite a bit then, or if you look behind you. And it is actually one hypothesis is that it's stress relieving. It's like what you do after you've had a little bit of stress, in fact. And then you kind of shake it off. once things seem safe again.
Thank you, Ruth. That was lots of fun. Pun on words. We're doing some light flicker work with turkeys, and they're always so interesting. And we attempted to do some novel object testing with the hens. So we put the object in the pen, 2 seconds until one hen grabbed it, ran like craziness with the other 300 hens following. Play behavior?
It depends what they do. So if it's only running away in order to kind of defend the resource from everyone else, and they don't turn around and say, and go back again into the crowd, maybe not play. It's tricky though. I recognize it's tricky, and that's probably why much of the literature in poultry, people have played it safe. They've been afraid to call things play. You see a lot of studies where there's running there or it's aggression. But my guess is that some of the aggression, maybe all of it in young birds, or almost all, is play. And some of the running is probably play, but some may not be. So it's hard to interpret then when it's lumped together.
Well, it certainly sucked as a novel object test, let me tell you.
And I have seen them looking at mirrors and pecking at them really hard, which then might seem a bit more aggressive in my view than playful.
I'm doing all the work, Profula.
So
You could jump and run as you're going.
So you mentioned that you saw play differences between slow and fast growers, but I noticed that the time point that you reported was at like 4 weeks old or 28 days. I'm curious if you think that you would still see that difference at like a younger age, like 2 weeks or so, or if you still see the difference, maybe it's a general motivation difference between the two strains, or if it's singularly that like the brothers start getting leg and health concerns at 4 weeks.
Okay, well, this is one of the challenges of observation methods, because if we had used videos, we probably would have also detected a difference when they were younger. But using our direct sampling method, looking 2 rows across, actually, young birds are too affected by that, and they will run, out of your area. So you don't see a difference because there aren't any birds there. So yeah, that's a methodological issue.
Join me in thanking our speaker again.
All right, I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Richard Blatchford, who is an Associate Extension Specialist at UC Davis, and his research and extension focus is on all poultry, whether small farm or commercial, looking at husbandry methods, welfare, and behavior. And with that, Richard?
All right. Thank you to everyone for having me come here today. I want to preface this by saying I am not a specialist in effective states for poultry, but as part of my program and part of my research, I have come to really appreciate the importance of effective state and what does it actually mean from the bird's perspective of what we're doing with them in terms of management and housing. So I'm going to start off by just sort of generally explaining what is an effective state. This is sort of a newer area, particularly for birds. It's been a little bit better researched with mammals. So an effective state is sort of that area when you're studying animal welfare where you delve into the feelings or the subjective experience of what that animal, how they're interacting with their environment. It's an attribute of the individual, and that's really important to know, especially when you work with poultry, and we generally think of things at a very high flock level. Subjective states and affective states, you really have to look at an individual. You can have multiple individuals that are in the same space, but maybe experiencing things very differently. Affective states can sort of be thought of in two different categories. The first is an emotional response. So this is sort of a quick response to something that happens in the environment. And so you get an emotional reaction from that animal. And these are things like care, play. Ruth did a great job segueing into mine. Panic, rage. So think, you're out, you're a chicken, you're out in a field, a hawk comes by, you probably are feeling fear, panic, you react, hopefully you survive. If you have, the predator goes away, and you stop feeling that fear and panic and move on with what you were doing before. An affective state, on the other hand, is a bit longer lasting. So it's a state, first of all, and it's one that you sort of is influenced by experiences that you've had in the past or you may be having currently. And so we think of things like excitement, contentment, anxiety, boredom, fearfulness, which is something I'll get to as we go along. So these are longer lasting states, and they may have more effect on an animal's welfare. And so these are the types of states that we try to understand in terms of what the animal is experiencing. So I have a picture here of hens that are sunbathing. And I think if any of you have actually seen hens sunbathing, you sort of think like that looks really luxurious and content, and we sort of anthropomorphically may think, okay, when I go out and sunbathe, I feel really good when I'm doing that. I feel very content. And oftentimes you think, okay, and that feeling lasted for quite a bit of my day until something else happened and you encountered a stressor, and that may have changed how you're feeling. So you can think about it that way. Measuring affective states can be very difficult, as you can imagine. We're trying to access what's happening inside the brain of an individual and what they're feeling, which can even be very tricky when we try to understand that about people and we're able to verbalize and understand how we're feeling that way. And so the sort of classic example of how tricky this is thinking about people riding a roller coaster. So if you look at these folks, the first four on this roller coaster cart, you can see behaviorally, they're all very similar. So they're all tensed, they all sort of have their mouths open to some degree. If you looked at them physiologically, they probably all have very rapid heart rates, increased respiratory rates. But what's actually happening? What's their experience of that? I would say, based on thinking about facial expressions in people, the fellow in the back is probably terrified, and the woman in the front is having the time of her life. So they're experiencing, although physiologically and behaviorally they appear very similar, the experience they have is very, very different. And so trying to capture what is that experience and how do we measure that experience when potentially all of our proxy indicators could be saying the same thing becomes very tricky. And so recent research is really trying to figure out how do we capture that. And affective states can be thought of in sort of a two-dimensional way. So you think about arousal levels, so you can have high arousal and low arousal. And then you can also have a valence, so negative and positive. And Ruth sort of touched on this a bit in terms of the research that's been done with negative affective states is probably the most complete that we have currently, and trying to understand what's associated, what behaviors, what physiology is associated with a negative affective state, and how do we move those individuals to a more positive state. What we have trouble with is understanding when you move an animal along that valence dimension, where do they actually go? So if you've reduced fearfulness in birds, are they still fearful? Did you actually move them out of that negative valence? Did you sort of get them in the middle, so they're just sort of, they're not really fearful, but they're not really feeling anything else either? Or have you pushed them into the positive side of that valence dimension and brought them into a more positive affective state. And that's, I think, sort of the cutting area now, is trying to figure out how do we know that they're in that positive state? What are the indicators that would tell us that we can measure that we know that they're in that state? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different types of measures that have historically and currently been used to try to access that information about that subjective experience. One of the probably most common historically are physiological measures. And that's probably because we have a lot of easy to measure physiological aspects that are well validated, particularly for poultry and for birds. So these are things like heart rate variability, glucocorticoids, neutrophil lymphocyte ratios, respiration rate, and you can probably imagine a lot more. The one thing we have to talk about in terms of physiological measures, though, is that they only infer an affective state. So think about the roller coaster example. Just because you're measuring increased heart rate doesn't necessarily mean that you're measuring what that affective state, what that subjective experience is. You'll know that you're measuring arousal, so you know that they're high aroused, but you don't know where that, on that valence dimension, those animals may be. An example of this is a study that looked at hens housed in enriched pens. So they gave these birds more space, perches, platforms, dust bathing areas, and opportunity to forage. And then they compared that with birds that were unenriched. And they did some really interesting work, and I'm only talking about a little piece of their study, where they measured resiliency of the birds, or ability to cope, by measuring changes in comb temperature during restraint and novel object tests. So sort of giving them some stress and seeing how they responded to that. And they did find a reduction in perceived aversiveness in birds that were reared in these enriched pens compared to those that were in non-enriched pens. So it seems that enrichment can have some effect on the effective state of the bird in terms of where they are in that sort of valence dimension. So the more resilient you are, we would consider you to be more in a positive affective state, that you're able to handle that and move on faster. We also have behavioral measures. And these are really good because they're easy to see. We can measure them. They're a reaction to the environment, so it gives us some sort of information about how that animal is actually interacting with the environment that they're in and how they're experiencing that environment. And they can be used as a proxy for affective states. Like physiology, they're not a perfect proxy, so also go back to that roller coaster picture, and you can see all of those people and very similar sorts of behavioral postures. So if we're measuring behavior, we might conclude that there was no difference. In terms of behavior, fearfulness is probably the most well understood affective state in poultry. There's been a lot of research that people have done. We have a lot of measures that we can take that have been validated. So you can look at things like startle response, tonic immobility, novel object tests, arena tests, inversion, human approach tests. Hopefully you understand there are lots of different options that we can use. And we know that this fearfulness can be related to experiences that an animal has in terms of how fearful they are or not, including aspects of housing. And so using behavior, you can assess the valence of an affective state. So we have some connections of, we know that these behaviors are associated with negative affect, less so or less understood with positive. And that behavioral studies oftentimes are directed at trying to decrease those negative states, so moving the birds from that negative part over to the positive. But again, the difficulty in interpretation is how far have you moved the individual? A couple of really common behavioral tests that are used to understand affective states are preference and motivation tests, because they can then help us understand how far have we moved the bird into that positive realm. And the one thing I want to say is that on their surface, preference and motivation tests appear to be quite simple types of behavioral tests, and they're actually very complicated to do. And the interpretation of those tests can be really tricky, and I'm going to give you an example of that. One thing that we have to be really careful of, especially working with poultry and birds in general, is that a lot of these tests are validated and have been developed for mammalian species. And so we take those tests and then we try to fix them to work better for an avian species. But you really have to think about biological relevance. There is a study looking at lighting and how important dark is to broilers that was done a number of years ago, and I'm not picking on them. It's a good study. But the conclusion of that paper was that dark was not important, but the way the birds could access darkness was by pecking. And pecking is not a behavior that birds associate with darkness. They would associate resting and sleeping. And so perhaps it's not surprising that they didn't do a lot of pecking to get darkness, because that wasn't sort of part of relevant to them biologically. So you really have to sort of think through how relevant is the task I'm trying to get them to make, or how relevant is the thing I'm asking them, how important it is to you. Timing can also be really important, particularly if you're looking at motivation, because motivational states can vary both with age and with time of day. So you have to sort of take that into account in terms of when you're testing the individuals and what does that mean. I have perching here because I think it's a really good example. It's an area that, for preferences, has been studied quite extensively for laying hens and what aspects of perching and all kinds of characteristics of perching are important. And it sort of happened in a very stepwise fashion that I think shows why these behavioral tests can be very tricky. So studies have looked at the characteristics of perching. So some studies have found that hens prefer round to square perching, and some studies have found the opposite, of course. There's also, it's been shown that hens have a sort of ranked preference. So height to hens is more important than a physical characteristic of the perch. So at lower levels, they may prefer round to square, but at higher levels, they'll show no preference because that height outranks their preference for the characteristic. We also need to think, is there a social influence here? So we also know that dominant individuals get access to higher areas than lower ranked individuals. And so knowing where your animals stand in terms of a social dominance can also come into play when you're looking at preferences. You may have a bird who's a subordinate individual and shows you a preference for a lower perch just because that's her life history of, I go to a lower perch or I'm going to get pecked at. And so she may show that even though height may actually be a preferred characteristic. And you really have to make sure that you have well-planned comparators. So you want to make sure that you're actually comparing two things that are different to the animal. So a lot of studies actually look at different types of resources, but from the animal's perspective, they're considered equal. And so you really have to make sure that you're looking at things that are actually different for the animal, and that really should interpret your results very narrowly. Because unless you test two things against each other for what the bird prefers, you never know. So if we had only looked at the shape of a perch and not at height, we wouldn't know that ranked preference occurs. And so now we know height is more important. So when we're providing that resource, we know we need to provide height. Cognitive bias testing is a fairly complicated type of testing. It's a newer type of testing, and again, this has really been developed with mammals, and that there are very few researchers, I think, who are working on this, so we're lucky to have Leonie here, with birds, because it is very difficult to adapt these types of tests to birds. So these tests are testing attention, memory, and judgment bias, and they're really trying to understand how an individual processes information. And so the idea is that if you are in a negative state, you process information differently than if you're in a positive state. And so by doing these tests, you can sort of get at that information. So I have an example here, a very general example, which is very much more complicated than I'm going to explain to you today. But essentially, this is one type of very common cognitive bias test. You may also have heard it referred to as a go, no-go type of test, where you train birds to associate a reward with a certain characteristic. So in this example, it would be the color white. And then you train birds to associate no reward with another type of characteristic, which is very different. And so here we have that in black. And once you have your birds trained, you present them with an ambiguous cue. So in this case, we have this gray. And you look to see, how does the bird interpret that ambiguous cue? Do they treat it like a reward, or do they treat it like a no reward? And if they treat it like a reward, we would say that those animals are optimistic. And if they treat it as no reward, you would say those animals are pessimistic. And these very similar types of tests are used with humans as well. So if you're feeling like you're identifying with this in some way, I tend to be the more pessimistic. You're right on track. So we know from studies that have been done that barren environments tend to have individuals that show the pessimistic response, and that enriched environments tend to provide animals that have an optimistic response. It's not 100%, but those are sort of general trends that we see. A couple studies that have used these types of techniques have found that exploratory hens, so they took birds where they raised them in an enriched and a non-enriched, and then they tried to control for personality of individuals by then parsing them into exploratory and non-exploratory hens. And they found that when raised in an enriched environment, exploratory hens were more opportunistic than the non-exploratory hens. So that also shows that personality traits may come into play and confound studies that if you're looking at a group level. Other studies have found that there's no difference in cognitive bias with enriched environments, and they have suggested that perhaps the environments weren't enriched differently enough. So similar to the example that Ruth used with the substrates, where both conditions were enriched, but one was sort of more enriched. In these studies, they suggested that the birds weren't perceiving a difference in the types of environments that they were providing. There are a couple caveats that I want to mention in terms of cognitive bias. If you're interested in doing cognitive bias studies, you really need to collaborate with somebody who's an expert in that field. I am lucky enough at Davis, we have an applied ethologist who is trained in experimental psychology and studies affective states. And so she mainly works with mammals, but I have pulled her towards birds more and more. Having that experimental psychology background is very important in terms of correctly setting up a cognitive bias test, partly because it involves a lot of training of the birds. So you need a really good understanding of learning theory and how to correctly operantly condition birds to even get to the testing portion. In every cognitive bias test, when you're doing the training component, there are birds who never hit the training criteria. So they're never trainable to get to the testing period. And so what does that mean? Typically, when you read a paper, they say 8 out of 10 birds made training criteria, and the 2 birds were taken out of the study. And you never sort of know what happens to those individuals. But from an affective state consideration, I think it's very important to try to understand what's happening with those individual animals that they can't perform that task that other individuals are able to do. Could they be experiencing a different affective state? They're very difficult to interpret. So you find that some animals are maybe more pessimistic. What does that mean? And then again, most tests are not valid for poultry. So can we assess affective states? Yes, but very carefully. Some tests are better at detecting arousal, others at detecting valence, but we really need to understand the two of them together. Again, interpretation should be narrow to your test results only and try to avoid a sort of overall generalization of the work. And we really need to understand when there's multiple tests available, how do they relate together? What does it mean? So for instance, this one study looked at startle response and judgment bias and found startle response was actually more sensitive to housing conditions than the judgment bias. They found no difference in judgment bias. So what does that mean when you have these conflicting results? Paul et al., because I'm running out of time, I'm going to go very quickly through this. This is a study that came out of the University of Bristol recently. It's an amazing, fantastic study, very complicated. But they looked at lots of different measures of affective states and tried to understand what the relationship was. And they actually looked at individual preferences for aspects of their living conditions and also the majority group preferences. And they found that there were differences between the individual and the group. And so what does that mean? And I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about that on this slide. So what's next in terms of this area? We really need a lot of validation of these tests, specifically for avian species, and especially for the cognitive tests. We need to better understand how these tests relate and what they tell us to really get a full picture of affective states. We need to really look at that group versus individual measures. So they actually found that some individuals, in the Paul study, they found some individuals were anti-preference. So they preferred conditions that were different from the majority preference. So what does that mean? Maybe there's some social influence in there. And then individual experience versus life history. So remember, I said affective states were the subjective experience of an individual. And so the life history of that individual can feed into whether you become optimistic or pessimistic. And then also try to understand what are the resiliency of affective states? How long do they last? How easy are they to change? Are some more easily changeable than others? And what does that mean in terms of the animal's welfare? And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. I just want to make the comment that I feel like if this room was given a cognitive bias test, we would all lean pessimistic because as scientists, that's how we're trained, right? Skepticism. Questions?
Could you explain more about the startle test? How they actually implement that into testing the birds and if that's used on hens and broilers? Thank you.
Yeah, so this test was done with laying hens. And essentially you startle the bird. So you create a condition where the bird becomes startled. And you test to see you can test intensity of startle response, whether they startle at all. And so the less of those types of behaviors that you see, the more resilient you would consider the individual. Hopefully that answered your question.
A nice presentation. You showed valences and arousal states with high arousal and low arousal. To what extent is this a good thing for an animal to be in a high state of arousal? Are we anthropomorphizing? Because I like to be in a high state of arousal, but many people don't.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think you have to think about quadrant with that particular diagram, right? So you can be at high arousal in a positive state. So excited, for instance, you have something coming up and you're feeling very excited about it over a period of time. You can be at a high state of arousal and in a negative state, so think about anxiety. I'm sure we probably all can relate to some anxiety, which is not very pleasant to experience, whereas the excitement probably is. And then you really have to think about the individual. So maybe there is someone who likes being stressed. Right? There are people who are better workers when they feel stressed than if they feel content, right? I mean, anyone who's a procrastinator knows. Once you hit that due date, you're like, I got to get this done, and you get your workout, and you feel accomplished after that. Other people can't work that way. So understanding those individual differences, and it could be that you have a life history experience that's different from somebody else that got you to that point. And so understanding how those life history differences affect an individual is really important in terms of getting that holistic picture. And I think it's a paradigm that's a little tricky for people who work with poultry to wrap your head around, moving from the flock to an individual. And sort of how do you really do that when you have 30,000 broilers in a building and really sort of focus in on individuals, or you have 200,000 hens in a house? How do we make that switch? So that's something people are trying to work on now.
Yeah, so really interesting talk. Thank you. So question I have, you've gone over in your talk a lot of different tests. Ruth went over a lot of other tests. And I'm wondering, if you were going to go in and try to assess the welfare of this barn, how many do you need to do? And where do you get to the point of having negative returns on it, on doing so many tests?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in terms of effective state, we're not there yet. So we can do things like look at play behavior to try to look at that sort of more positive aspect. But I think that these are tests that are really still being developed and validated in the smaller university scale systems, and they have a lot of work to go before we can take them out. Clearly, we couldn't do cognitive bias testing as sort of a welfare audit because you need to train birds. The labor involved is just not there, nor could you go back in and pick out the individual that you trained to then give the test to. So I think this idea of really trying to understand if we can figure out cognitive testing and what does that mean for an individual at a small scale, and if we can relate that to some of these perhaps easier to do behavioral or physiological tests that could be incorporated into a welfare audit, that's where we really need to go. We need to find those proxies that are really easy to observe. As a previous auditor, I understand how laborious those are, and you don't want to build in a lot of behavioral tests because they take a lot of time, and you're taking the time of the producer as well. So yeah, trying to simplify those, but we have a lot of work to do on the small scale in this area in particular.
Well, I'm sure you're aware of qualitative behavior analysis, which was considered to be the only method that could be applied on the farm in the welfare quality program. Maybe you could comment on that.
So qualitative behavioral assessment, I don't know, some of you probably may not be familiar with that. It's basically a way of going in and you sort of make these qualitative assessments on the behavior of the animal. So you rate sort of what does the animal appear to be? Are they excited? Are they depressed? Some of these more species kind of specific behaviors. It is, they are a sort of a validated test that were developed out of Europe. So perhaps my European colleagues can comment better than I. They're not used very frequently in the US. And I think there's just some skepticism about what do they really mean and how well do you have to be familiar with that type of species or even that individual to know, to be able to make that judgment call of what does this mean for that animal. So it hasn't been as widely adopted here, to my knowledge, with poultry anyway. Thank you.
So I have the honor of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Ingrid de Jong. Sorry, I'm not Dutch. And she is a senior researcher at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and her research focuses on broiler and broiler breeder welfare. And with that, I will enable editing and turn it over to Dr. de Jong.
So, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for inviting me to give a presentation here. I think we have a very nice session on environmental enrichment for poultry. In my presentation, I will focus on environmental enrichment and whether there are any beneficial effects on welfare. And I won't talk about behavior because that will be covered in other presentations. So, just before starting giving the overview of what has been done, of what has been found in recent years, I first would like to define environmental enrichment. And we usually use a definition of Ruth, actually, saying that it is an improvement in the biological functioning of captive animals resulting from modifications in the environment. And in our review, we added some additional aspects or definitions to that. If we say it should encourage species-specific behavior, it improves the ability to cope with challenges, but we also said it should maintain or improve animal health, and that's the part where I will focus on today. My focus is whether environmental enrichment can have a positive effect on broiler welfare other than behavior, and if so, that might be very interesting because then there might be economic benefits and also stimulation for implementation in practice. So what did I consider as enrichment in this kind of mini review? I included everything related to increasing environmental complexity, and I would also like to say something about including about daylight in broiler houses. I did not include any studies related to stocking density, although some also include that in a definition of environmental enrichment. I also did not include light aspects other than daylight. I think that's a whole topic as such and might be a bit too complicated to include here. And I also did not include larger distances between feed and water. But we should, of course, keep in mind when I give an overview of the results of recent literature that there might be interaction effects. For example, with stocking density when we look at the effects of environmental enrichment. So, first of all, as an example, I used elevated purchase, but that can also be other types of enrichment. There can, of course, be two types of effect. You can have either an indirect effect, where the enrichment, for example, stimulates locomotor activity, which may have a positive effect on bone strength, so it increases bone strength, and therefore may positively affect walking ability. So that's the indirect effect of potential indirect effect of environmental enrichment. But it can also be a direct effect. For example, if you provide birds with purchase, they might be less in contact with litter, which can be of suboptimal quality, and then it might have a beneficial effect on contact dermatitis. So what I did here is that I make a kind of a summary of what has been found in the scientific literature since the review of Anja and others in 2018, which covered all literature from 2000 to 2018, and also the paper of Petersen and Forkman, who also summarized the effect of environmental enrichment on welfare aspects. And you will see that leg health is the most frequently included welfare indicator in all the different papers, and that's of course because there are some issues with leg health in broiler chickens. But also some other indicators were included as well. And now I will just briefly, one by one, say something about the most recent findings regarding the different types of enrichment, and then I will end up with some general comments and conclusions. So to start with purchase, we know that purchase potentially can meet the need to rest on an elevated structure, but we also know that the use of purchase by broiler chickens is quite variable and is, for example, depending on the material of the purchase, the height, the accessibility, and the broiler strain. And especially in fast-growing broiler chickens, the use of purchase is reported to be low, and that can be, of course, of the physical limitations. So they have to jump on the perch, they have to keep the balance when sitting on the perch, and that might be more difficult if you have a relatively heavy breast weight or walking difficulties. Purchase can potentially benefit walking ability through increased exercise, jumping on, jumping off the perch, trying to balance on the perch, and potentially reduce contact dermatitis because the birds are away from the litter. If we look in the literature, we see that studies are particularly focused on effects on welfare of fast-growing strains, but they already explained that fast-growing strains might have some difficulties to access the purchase, so that might maybe explain the fact that actually when you look at the effect of purchase on welfare indicators, that few studies found some positive effects, but also many studies did not find any effect at all. So some positive effects were found on contact dermatitis, so less footpad dermatitis, less hock burn when providing purchase. And older studies found some positive effects on tibial morphological characteristics, but not many positive effects are found in recent literature. Another way of providing elevated resting area is providing platforms instead of perches. And we know that these are very well used by both fast and slow-growing broiler strains. And also that they use the area under the platforms quite well. As you can see on this picture, this is made in a commercial house. These two pictures. On the left, it are the relatively small birds. They're mainly sitting under the perch, also because here they have a quite steep ramp to the platform. But at an older age, you see that the platforms are very well occupied by the birds. And in practice, both the solid elevated platforms are used, sometimes with some litter on it, and also wire platforms. It's preferred to provide ramps, preferably not too steep, although I put a question mark. We think that might have some negative effects, but we are not sure about that. That's something that needs to be studied further. When we talk about elevated platforms, there have been found some beneficial effects on walking ability, especially in slower growing strains, and I will show one example in the next slide. They're also reported to reduce footpad dermatitis in broiler chickens, but also quite some studies did not find any effect at all. And also one study reported that there were more dirty feathers, and they explained it because the birds could also sit under the platform, and in that case it was a wire platform, so that's why the reason why the birds were more dirty. And you can see this on this slide. I show you the example. This is the study where they found more dirty birds. On the right hand is the German study of the group of Julia Molgo. They had wire platforms with a ramp. The birds made quite well used platforms, but you see also in their figure, they measured the latency to leave a rod, a rotating rod. The higher the latency, the better the walking ability, and they found differences in the slower growing, in this case a dual purpose strain with a higher latency in the enriched treatment group, but no effects on the fast growing strain. Another type of enrichment which is really frequently used in practice, at least in our country, are bales. They may have various functions. They can be used as an elevated resting area because the birds can sit on the bale as long as the bales are intact. They provide cover in the large broiler house, which is a large open space. Bales may provide cover. The birds are sitting around the bales, they provide structure in the house, and they increase the opportunity for explorative behavior. And as they may stimulate activity, exploration, they may also improve walking ability potentially. And they may potentially influence the litter quality, or maybe even reduce contact dermatitis because the broilers may rest on the bale. And here I show some examples of bales in commercial houses in our countries. So sometimes farmers use plastic wrapped wood shavings bales for broiler chickens. They sometimes cut the bale open so that the broilers can really peck at the wood shavings, and otherwise they make a hole in it and they peck at it. We have lucerne bales. Here you see nicely that the birds are really clustering around a bale, really the functioning of structuring the open space in the broiler house. And here, a bit older, you also see that they use the bale to sit on top of it. And these are straw bales which are also frequently used in the commercial broiler systems in the Netherlands. The thing is that in practice, they very often use quite firmly pressed bales, and for young birds it's really difficult to pull out the straw or the lucerne to really play with it. It's more easy for the older birds, and also when the birds are really close to slaughter age, they usually remove the wraps, and then the bale bales fall apart and birds can play with all the loose straw, for example. Some older studies report positive effect on walking ability, but if I looked in the more recent literature, there were no positive effect on welfare indicators reported. A relatively new enrichment, which is not used in practice or not that much used in practice, is the use of live insects. It may stimulate locomotory and foraging behaviors. Birds are very eager to peck and eat the insects. They show foraging behavior around the time of providing the insect, and they really scratch and peck in the litters, which may be positive for contact dermatitis as well. Two studies were carried out from Alison Ipema, where she looked at walking ability, contact dermatitis, tibia morphology and strength, when she provided black soldier fly larvae in different concentrations and different frequencies. And she found positive effects in one study and no effects at all in the other study, and I will show the example in the next slide. And I think there's really a need for further testing under commercial conditions and not only under experimental conditions. Here you see one of her graphs where she looked at the hockburn score, and you see here that with the highest proportion of black soldier fly larvae, the birds had a better so less hockburn as compared to the control or the low proportions of black soldier fly larvae. And she found the same here for the gait score, which was better when they had the highest proportion of larvae and when these were provided either 2 times or 4 times per day. And well, finally, there were some studies with other point source enrichments, but these were all single studies, and it's very difficult to draw a single conclusion about the effectiveness of these enrichments in relation to broiler welfare other than the behavior. The interesting thing is that we also have more complex environments, and one example is when you provide the broilers with an outdoor range or a covered veranda. They may give different maybe more variable for the birds. The birds can perform different types of behaviors in these environments. And we know that the effect of outdoor range on welfare indicators can really vary, which likely depends on the condition of the range and the actual use by the birds. But there are remarkably no studies on the effect of covered verandas, while these are also very interesting in relation to welfare. There are some system comparisons, but these often include other aspects like different strains, different stocking densities. So it's difficult to draw a conclusion about really the effect of the covered veranda on welfare indicators. So these may be beneficial, but more research is needed. What's particularly also interesting is combining different types of enrichments. These can potentially meet different behavioral needs for the birds. For example, by combining environmental enrichments that can stimulate explorative behavior by enrichments that meet the need for resting on an elevated area, like bales with platforms or insects and perches or other combinations. And when you look in the literature, interestingly, quite some papers looked at these combinations of the different types of enrichments. And also quite some positive effects were found. And I don't list this whole list of papers, but you can see that there were quite some studies, and many of these reported some positive effects of combinations of enrichments on welfare aspects. And it's of course difficult to say whether that's because they had one single effective enrichment that caused the effect, but it can also be that the variety, combination of the different enrichments stimulated certain behaviors, which in turn had a positive effect on some welfare indicators. I think particularly interesting were the 2 studies in Norway, which are the studies of Fasdal and Ben-Sassi, where they looked at the combination of enrichments in commercial conditions, and they found some positive effects. And in the study of Ben-Sassi, the most positive effect was found if if more enrichment types were combined. So that's, I think, really interesting area. This is one example of our own group where we looked at a combination of different enrichments. On top you see the barren pen where there is no enrichment, and the bottom you see the pen where we combined elevated platforms, a dust bathing area, barrier perches, and we observed, won't go through the whole table, that some tibial biophysical characteristics were improved for both fast and slower growing strain in the enriched environment. So that's potentially very interesting. You can also increase the complexity of the environment by providing daylight access to the broiler house. And more farmers, at least in our country, have windows in the house. It provides different light spectra, different light intensities, and we have seen that this stimulates broiler activity. And broilers make also better use of the environmental enrichment if combined with natural light. And in an older study, it was found that straw bales and natural light improve walking ability, but there are not many other recent studies showing positive effect on welfare indicators. And we in our study did also not find any effect apart from an effect on the behavior of the birds. I just want to mention that it might be interesting to also look at increased environmental complexity and resilience, so the ability to cope with challenges from the environment, including diseases. And I think this is an area that definitely needs some more attention. For example, it's known from pigs that when they are housed in a complex environment with different enrichments, they're better able to cope with an infection, so they recover faster from the infection, and that might be interesting to further study in broiler chickens. So when we look at what has been found in the previous years, it's clear that there's no really very clear effect of whether environmental enrichment really have a beneficial effect on welfare indicators other than the behavior. And of course, I did not really go into detail, but there's a huge variation in the type of enrichment, the actual material of the enrichment, the number of enrichment that's provided. So I think that these apparently contradicting effects can be explained by the fact that not all enrichments were very well used by the birds. So that might be different and depend on how the enrichments were designed. And also whether the enrichment actually stimulates activity. If you look at walking ability, you expect that it would be improved if activity is really stimulated. And sometimes you really question whether the enrichment actually does stimulate activity, for example. Further, many experiments were carried out under experimental conditions, relatively small pens. And the effects of enrichment may really differ when you have commercial conditions. So I also would like to call for more research under commercial conditions. And also, many studies had relatively good gauge scores or really absence of contact dermatitis, and then you cannot find an effect of your enrichment, for example. So there are areas for further research. We should look further in the material design and especially the number of enrichments when you talk about commercial practice. Like I said, I would really be in favor of more tests on the commercial conditions because it really differs from the relatively small pens where we often perform our research. We should also look at enrichments which are suitable for the different types of birds. Some enrichments are more suitable for slower growing strains than for fast growing strains and the other way around. And the interesting area is also the effective combinations of enrichments, including the role of daylight or light, and also the effect of veranda and outdoor ranges. And of course the interaction with other factors like stocking density. And I already talked about resilience. So to conclude, is environmental enrichment beneficial for welfare? Maybe I should turn it the other way around. Little harmful effects have been reported. Either studies show no effect on welfare indicators or a positive effect. I think there is no doubt, but the other speakers will go more in detail about it, that effective environmental enrichment will have beneficial effects on behavior and also on the emotional state of broiler chickens. And that will be explored in other presentations, of course. And, well, as we do not always observe beneficial effects of environmental enrichment on welfare indicators, but it might be really relevant, for example, in relation to leg health and walking ability, which is still quite an important welfare issue in broiler chickens. So if with environmental enrichment we can improve walking ability of the birds, it would be really great, I think. So, thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, I will be pleased to answer these.
Thank you for the nice review. So I'm not familiar with the Giza paper about feeding black soldier fly, but while there's nutritional benefits for those insects, I was curious, is it the foraging activity? Are they loose in the litter? Or what is the parameters that might have improved foot pad or gait?
Yeah.
I forget what it was.
Yeah, I think it's especially the foraging behavior and the activity around the time that these larvae are provided. I think if you look, well, that's still a bit of the question, but if you look at overall activity over the day, I doubt whether the overall activity is really increased. But you see them specifically being active around the time of providing the larvae, and that might still be, sufficient to have any positive effects because they forage more. And they're really active around that time. And also, during some time after provisioning the larvae, they stay active because they search for more for quite a while. And you see the effects if you provide them more larvae, so that already indicates that you have to provide a certain amount to find these positive effects. Yeah.
I have a question, sorry, then I'll come to you. Right here.
Sorry.
So we know that enrichment used with broilers decreases with age, but could you maybe speak to certain types of enrichments being more preferred at different ages, or is it just generally all enrichment use decreases with age?
Yeah, well, I'm not so sure that all enrichment use indeed decreases with age. For example, if you provide them with elevated platforms and you look at how these are occupied, and if it's really easy for the birds to access these elevated perches, you see that they're quite well used throughout age until slaughter age. So it's not always, I think it very much depends on the specific type of the enrichment and how these are designed, whether they're actually used in young and older birds.
So, sorry, follow-up question. Should we add more enrichments then later since the occupancy decreases with age?
Well, I don't say it really increases. I say it stays interesting with age, so they make use of it at all ages. I think anyway we should look at how much enrichment we should provide, because often if you look on the commercial conditions, it's only for 5 or 10% of the birds in a house. So that only means that a relatively small proportion of the birds can make use of the enrichment, while maybe if you provide more, then also more birds would make use of it, and it could also profit from the enrichment being present. So that's definitely an area that needs more attention. Yeah.
Apologies if I'm stating something that might be already obvious, but the big challenge seems to be getting the large-scale trials. I'm wondering, is it possible if you can persuade some large producers in countries where there's good sort of traceability, that you could be using the sort of post-mortem or slaughterhouse data, because it's all about big data these days, so we're told. Yeah. Is there some way that you could persuade some of these producers to do trials over several years, even, or several flocks?
Yeah, that might be.
You kind of think that would smooth out the rough and tumble of the data.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion, and that's also what we are trying to. But first, you have to persuade them to really apply the enrichment, and then you have to. You need your control houses, your enriched houses during a longer time. But I fully agree with you. That would be really interesting, and maybe also prove that it might be positive, also with respect to the welfare indicators, so not only behavior. Because of course also differences between individual flocks. Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Building on that question,
what would be your top 2 recommendations for a commercial house, given most use by the birds, the best response, and the likelihood of the grower doing it?
So well, I would recommend a type of enrichments, you mean, right? I would recommend platforms, so elevated platforms, resting as elevated resting areas in combination with something which stimulates their activity, which can be either bales or maybe wood shavings bales or something like that. So combining the exploration enrichment together with a resting enrichment. And actually that's also something we did in a smaller scale trial. And there we also noticed, and we are currently working on the results, that you can then really separate resting from active birds. And that's particularly interesting because you get also less disturbance of resting birds, because we saw really the birds choosing the platforms for resting, so you get a kind of defined resting areas, and you get kind of activity areas in the broiler house, and it's really nicely separated activities, which I think may really have positive effects in the end. Also in relation to scratches, for example.
Quick question on perches. So one set of studies we did years ago most of the work was done at Perdue on laying hens was looking at their responses in heat stress. So the perch in this case was a cooling device. So, but you didn't really talk about the environmental side of enrichments, and I'd be curious of your opinion about that. Do we get to count it as an enrichment as well as a direct welfare check?
Yeah, well, I think I think it's quite effective if you provide cooling perches, especially in hot condition, but also for maybe the standard broiler chicken, which I think sometimes suffers a bit from heat stress because the litter has quite a high temperature. So birds can then go off the litter, and you can provide it by a perch, but if you can really provide a cool perch, that might be particularly interesting, I think. Yeah, if that answers your question.
I would like to ask you a question regarding the live insects. So with the live insects given to the birds, they might have some nutritional benefit. And then with that birds having nutritional benefit, what do you expect are any kinds of positive impact on the welfare because of the better nutritional benefit to the birds? And then what different kinds of live birds do you recommend to use?
What kind of insects are?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's still much research going on in that area. So at this stage, for me, it's really difficult to say, oh, well, you have to use these types. We are currently, I know that especially in our country at least, different types of insects are being tested. So it's not only black soldier fly larvae, which have been tested in this trial, but also different types. So it's all in progress, I would say, yeah.
I think what first part of the question was whether the nutritional benefits could impact welfare, like
sorry, I didn't get that one. Sorry. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. It could be, yeah. In the studies we did, we tried at least to have the nutritional value equal between the diet with the live insects and the control diets. But still, of course, there can be some mechanism through the gut-brain axis where you have some effect on welfare. Yeah. Something which needs to be studied. Sorry, I didn't get one. Yeah.
All right, let's all thank Ingrid. Thank you.
All right, we have one presentation before the break, and then we'll have two more after that. For our next presentation, it is going to be about stimulating and modifying broiler behavior by provision of biologically relevant environmental enrichment. And to give this presentation, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Anja from the Department of Animal Science at Aarhus University from the Denmark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I brought some notes, as I'm not a native English speaker, but yeah, hopefully I don't need them. Anyway, I'm very happy to come here today to give a talk about environmental enrichment for broilers. It has been, in my opinion, it has a great potential for improving the welfare of the birds. So first, a bit of background. Broilers, they are notoriously known as being inactive. It has been shown repeatedly that the performance of non-essential active behavior, such as locomotion and foraging, is reduced with age. As you see here in the figure, where the proportion of the time budget taken up by locomotion decreases with age. Also, active behaviors, some types of them at least, will be performed in a less physical, strenuous manner. I don't know if you can distinguish it on the photo here, but it shows broilers that are feeding in the position that is normal for a gallus gallus, so standing, and broilers that are feeding in a position that you sometimes see in broilers. It's abnormal because it's sitting. Thus, it is a fact that the level of the activity decreases in broilers. Sorry, anyone? Oh. One explanation to this decrease in activity level is that the walking ability worsens with age, as you see here in the figure, where you can see a deterioration from age 21 to 27, and it continues also at later ages. It is also known that the poorer the walking ability, the slower and less the broilers will move, as in this experimental study where the birds would move slower, the worse the walking ability, assessed again as a gait score. And interestingly, you can see this effect already at the lower gait scores that are expressing only minor defects in walking ability. A bird that has a poor walking ability will also be the one that will perform more behaviors in a less physical strenuous manner. This has been shown, for example, in gait score 2 birds with a gait score 2, where they will spend more time sitting while feeding compared to birds with a normal gait score, so it's gait score 0. The level of activity decreases with age, and it seems to be linked with the decrease in walking ability with age. However, when looking into the housing condition of broilers, one may start questioning if that's if there is more to this explanation. Could it be that the condition contribute to this decrease in walking ability, in activity? Well, generally speaking, the housing conditions are barren and they are lacking any sort of enrichment. The space available is very homogeneous, so not exactly inviting for exploratory behavior. The only resource available is the flooring material, but that well, apart from the essential resources that are necessary for survival and growth, but the bedding material will also deteriorate as the broiler mature. Thus, a question that has been asked in the studies that I will go through in a minute is whether more complex environments can stimulate or modify the activity of the broilers. Now, I have used both the terms complexity and enrichment, so I would like to start with an explanation of these in relation to the topic of today. Well, environmental complexity is sort of the umbrella of any change that adds to more heterogeneity in the environment of the broilers. It may be complexity that forces the birds to change the behavior, potentially leading to more activity. It could be, for example, increased distances between essential resources. It could be placement of barriers or panels in the environment, or it could be the use of intermittent light programs. Importantly, these are not necessarily categorized as enrichment. Then there are other types of environmental complexity which are categorized as enrichment. Enrichment comes also in different categories. One type is the point source enrichment, which is enrichment objects or devices that are often limited in size and only placed in a few or a single location in the barn. It can be things such as rings of peat, or it can be platforms, for example. Then there is the combination of different types of enrichment, often targeting different motivational behaviors of the broilers. So it could be, for example, peat, targeting the foraging, the exploration, and the dust bathing behavior, combined with platforms targeting the need for resting in an elevated position. Then enrichment can be more complex enriched environments that differ more radically from conventional production systems and have been designed to meet key behavioral needs of the animals. These can be either systems that with, for example, a covered veranda, outdoor access, it can be mobile houses, but it can also be indoor systems that are based on animal welfare concepts. So now we arrived at the aim of today's talk, which is to review, a mini review, how to enrich or modify the environment of the broilers to stimulate active behavior, and to discuss which influencing factors to consider. And I thank Ingrid for already introducing quite a large number of the things that I'm going to talk about, but here with the focus on activity. So, if we start with the types of complexity that are not necessarily categorized as enrichment, then one approach is to increase the distance between feed and water lines. It forces the broilers to travel longer distances to reach essential resources. In the German study here, the distance was increased from 2 meters to 12 meters, and it resulted in more standing, which is categorized as an active behavior, in more locomotion and more foraging, and lower time spent resting. I would though, so it increases activity, but I would though raise concern that whether it might have some negative effects on the welfare at high stocking densities, this approach. Because could it be that the broilers experience that it's difficult to access the resources, feed and water, at high stocking densities when this study here was only at 30 kilos per square meter, whereas the normal stocking density in the European Union is around 40 kilos per square meter. I don't know what it is in pounds. Another way to increase environmental complexity would be to provide barrier perches. Like with the increased distance between feed and water, it forces the broilers to travel longer distances to obtain essential resources. It can be categorized as an enrichment because it provides the opportunity of undisturbed rest in an elevated position. We also know that it affects the time budget. We see fewer but longer visits at the feed and water, but it's questionable whether activity levels are affected. Like you see here in the figure, that they found that the birds having barrier perches would be lying less on the floor as compared to those that didn't, but they would also spend time perching, which is an inactive behavior. If we then move on to the point source types of enrichments, then scattering of feed items seems to have a potential, although depending on a number of factors. Scattering of whole wheat as a supplement to feed in the trough has no effect on the activity. scattering of highly valued resource mealworms has an effect on the activity level immediately after the provision, but not at later observation periods. Then we come back to the study Ingrid was also talking about with the black soldier fly larvas, where they looked more deeply into the amount provided and the frequency that the provision was given daily. And there they actually found, they actually looked into every hour during the day, and they found that the higher the dose and the more frequent the provision of black soldier fly larvas, the more active the birds were. And this was valid for all the active behaviors and at most ages. So scattering of highly valued feed at a sufficiently high dose and frequency increase activity throughout the day. The literature also provides strong evidence that broilers prefer some bedding materials over others, and among the most preferred are sand and peat, at least of the ones tested or examined. And this has, there has been suggestions based on that whether allocation of these materials will stimulate increased activity of the broilers. And yes, indeed, some studies have found foraging and dust bathing activity to be increased when providing preferred bedding materials, like the one here, where the broilers had access to sand and wood shaving compared to only wood shavings. But there are also studies that show no difference. Thus, at the moment, we cannot really conclude on the effect of bedding material on activity level. If we then move on to more complex enriched environments, then systems with a covered veranda or an outdoor area are good examples of these more radical changes in the bird's environment. In these systems, the birds have access to natural weather conditions, including sunlight, which is necessary for sunbathing behavior, a positive affective state, maybe. They also have access to vegetation if it's an outdoor range, or they have space suitable for roughest provision if it's in a covered veranda. They're also exposed to different flooring materials, and if they're lucky, some arthropods or insects or something like that. They have more space, not only outdoor, but also the birds that chooses to stay indoor, they will also benefit from part of the flock being outdoor. And it has been found that the veranda and outdoor range seems to promote activity, as active behavior is mainly found to be performed outdoor. Complex enriched environments have the potential to increase activity, but more research is needed because very little has been done on this. I could go on with more examples of studies on how to stimulate and modify broiler activity, but I've chosen to prioritize to include some discussion on factors that influence the gains and benefits of the environmental enrichment or complexity provided, as this is so important for the success achieved that it needs to be addressed every time that we talk about enrichment. So, as for any animal species, enrichment needs to be biologically relevant to be effective. I have numerous examples of enrichment provided that does not live up to this criteria. And the result is that the birds do not use the enrichment, and then the farmers start questioning why should we provide enrichment when the birds are not using it. One example that I would like to go a bit deeper into is outdoor ranges, as these have to be structured in a way that accommodate the needs and preference of the broilers for high use to occur. This includes that trees and bushes, it includes trees and bushes because they are preferred to open short grass habitats, reflecting that the broiler is a descendant of the jungle fowl who spends most of its time in the clearings of the jungle. Also, broilers, they are quality conscious, so they prefer natural vegetation such as trees and bushes to artificial structures such as A-frames. And not only will the broilers use the range more if the range is structured appropriately, they will also be more active when they're out in the range, as shown in this study here, where the range was either short grass or it had stripes of sorghum, sort of a tall grass. And they found that both during the summer and winter time, when the outdoor area was enriched, then more broilers would spend time outdoor, and they would be moving more, they would be standing more, and they would be lying less. So, yeah. Then for point source types of enrichments, a concern has been raised, Ingrid also mentioned it, whether the amount of enrichment provided, the number of locations where it's provided, and the frequency of provision are sufficient to truly function as enrichment for the entire flock. If, for example, only 6 straw bales is placed in a barn of 30,000–40,000 birds, it is really hard to argue that the environment is enriched, as only a few broilers will in fact have the opportunity or the benefit from the provision. On the other hand, a patchy distribution creates functional spaces where the broiler has to move between the different highly valued resources suitable for help. The best thing would be that they were suitable for different motivated behaviors, so they would move between them. This way, some types of enrichments that are not directly involving active behavior, such as elevated platforms, might indirectly stimulate activity, as the broiler have to perform this locomotive behavior to access them. But this remains speculation, as it has yet to be demonstrated. So amount, distribution, and frequency are important factors, but it is a research area that has received relatively little attention so far. Genetics play a major role in the activity level exhibited by the broilers. For example, it has been shown that fast growth rate reduce activity level and may hamper the use of enrichments. This is illustrated in the example here, showing that the broilers, if you look to the right of the table, the slower growing broilers are, the fast growing broilers are using the enrichment less than the slower growing. But here in this case, it's only the structures provided that promotes resting, that they use less. Also, different genotypes vary in their propensity of being fearful, but research has shown that this may not necessarily influence how the genotype exploits the environmental enrichment. Like in this study here, Linhan and colleague, they showed that Rowan Ranger broilers were more fearful in a tonic immobility test than Ross 308, but they found that they made as much use and as many visits to the outdoor range as the Ross 308. One more factor to keep in mind is genetics, as it may influence the use of enrichment. We know that high stocking densities result in reduced locomotor activity, so the space allowance influences the possibility and the effort needed to approach and use enrichment, and this is especially, might affect the use of it, yes, so we have the risk of lower use at higher stocking densities. And one example here that I show here is reduced use of perches when the stocking density is high. Here, at 8 birds per square meter, they found a higher use of perches at age 4 and 5 weeks, which is the age where the space allowance becomes more limited because of the growth of the birds. So an important factor to keep in mind is that lower stocking densities allow for better use of the enrichment. Then the final factor that I will mention here today is light. We know that light schedules and intensity, actually all aspects about light that broilers are exposed to, affect their activity level as well as the activity pattern. This means that the use and effect of enrichment is also influenced by light. One example here, also mentioned by Ingrid, is a study where they provided purchased bales of wood shavings and metal chains, and they found an increased rate of foraging and exploration, but only if they provided daylight as well. So that's the column, the second last column. If they didn't provide daylight, then the broilers would choose to spend more time resting on the perches provided. So that's the middle column here, the E treatment. Another important factor to keep in mind is the lighting condition that the broilers are exposed to. So time to sum up, the activity level of broilers can be increased by environmental enrichment or environmental complexity. The increased activity gained is likely an expression of the housing conditions, better meeting the behavioral needs of the broilers. Care should be taken to choose biologically relevant enrichment and ensure sufficient provision. The benefits gained by providing enrichment are influenced by genotype, stocking density, and light intensity, in addition to other factors. Challenges remain to be overcome, including how to ensure that all birds have access to the enrichment, at which frequency to renew or provide enrichment, and what amount of enrichment to provide. So these were the final words from me. Thank you for your attention, and also thank you to the organizers of this symposium. I'm happy to.
Since you mentioned that environmental enrichments get used less as the fast-growing broilers get older and get heavier, would you say a better way to address this issue is to try and adjust the enrichments to be more accessible to the birds that are now more of a challenge for them to use it? Or do you think it would be more effective to address it by changing the genetics so that that was less of an issue in the first place?
The easy way to change it would be to change the genetics if you don't think about the economy in it. I think most people would not agree, if you don't think about the economy. I think we have to work with what is presently in the market. I think we will slowly, in Europe, maybe it will be a bit slower now with the crisis in Ukraine on the increasing food prices, but I think we are slowly moving towards slower growing genotypes. In the Netherlands, for example, in Denmark, where I come from, we are fast changing to slower growing genotypes. In Denmark, we changed from having about 1% a few years ago, I mean really like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, to now having something like 80% of the broilers being of a slower growing genotype. But I don't expect that to happen for the rest of the world. So we have to work with enrichment that addresses and is suitable for the animals, the genotype that is on the market.
Thanks, very interesting. I'm just curious about the outdoor access. Have there been any concerns or issues or just general thoughts about biosecurity from one flocks to the next flocks? I mean, to the next flock. Could it even benefit their health by giving them greater exposure to antigens at a younger age? I don't know. Is there any studies or thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I know of any studies on that. In general, studies on outdoor access are really limited. But practically, it used to be in Denmark, for example, that they would have to have 2 outdoor ranges attached to one broiler house or one poultry house, and then they would alternate between these ranges between the flocks to avoid these biosecurity problems. But again, economy is a big factor, and it's very expensive to operate like that. So we also moved away from that. Yeah, that's the short answer.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to talk more about motivation, and especially with the ranging broilers. How much of it is a can't versus won't sort of situation? So is it the physically unable broilers are less likely to roam, or is it just that they're more fearful? Because it's a very low percentage actually use the ranges, right, like in certain places.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's a really hard question also to do research on. I think that the issue with broilers is that they only they live for a very limited time, right? So they have to be matured enough to be able to go outdoor, to keep warm outdoor, and then within a few weeks they will be slaughtered. I mean, like 2 weeks or 3 weeks sometimes. So it's first they have to be habituated to the outdoor range before you can actually start talking about whether they are motivated or whether it's the physical capability that is affecting the low use often of the range. But I think when you do studies like the one I showed on the gait score and the time spent sitting while feeding, I think that these are showing that if you have a broiler, for example, with a normal walking ability of a gait score 0, they will spend more time on normal behavior. So those that have a gait score higher, I would think at least that they are as motivated as the others to behave as they do. But of course, again, it's one of these research areas that is really difficult to do research into, yeah. But good question. Who's first?
I just have a question. I'm curious about the study that you showed where you separated the feeder from the water source, basically forcing them to work harder to get to the water. I was just wondering if there's any follow-up studies on that or any data. I just wonder if there's any unintended negative consequences with something like that, because although, yes, you're improving some welfare by increasing, the activity, I almost wonder if you make it harder for them to get water, if they might then overconsume the water. They drink more at one sitting, for instance, which the overconsumption of water, I wonder if that would have any negative consequences on litter quality, for example. And so just curious to know if there's any follow-up on looking at improving one type of welfare, but then making it negative unintentionally somewhere else.
Well, the only study I at least know of is the study that I did myself, but I was a chicken, so I didn't dare to keep these long distances at the older ages. So what we did was, and I didn't have the option of keeping them at a lower stocking density because we did a comparison of different types of point source enrichment in the same study. So in the treatment with the longer distances between the feed and water, as far as I remember, they were 22 days with the long distance, and then we moved back the feed and the water because we had this concern that whether they, at a stocking density of 40 kilos per square meter, were able to actually access the feed and water. So I was a chicken. But we did find, if I can finalize, we did find an increase in activity level during those first weeks of longer distances. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. Just a quick question. I know we're still trying to understand how many is enough, enrichments and things like that, but one question I have is, has anybody ever thought about the fact that when we don't have enough, that there may be frustration because I can't utilize it because it's, Now, they may not peck each other, but from an affective state, could that be something we need to consider and evaluate?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I can't think of any who has done something like that, so maybe that's one of the low-hanging fruits, as Ruth was talking about. Yeah, that's the short answer. You know of one, or?
Well, I could just mention that we looked with peat, which broilers love, even though it's not environmentally sustainable. So we have to find an alternative. But we looked at how they responded to intermittent provision of peat. And basically, they weren't frustrated when they saw it. They went for it, and they remembered it from the last time that they'd had it, and they went straight for it.
Thank Anja, and then so we have a break until 3:30. And then I would expect all of you, and probably even more of you, to be here at 3:30 because we have two excellent speakers who will share practicality of enrichment use in the industry.